Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am with unwavering commitment to the cause of great conversation, your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran. Thank you so very much for joining me today. My guest today is Joseph Pearce. English by birth, American by choice, Joseph stands astride the Atlantic like a genial, well-dressed Catholic colossus, casting not a shadow, but a ray of luminous light in the warming glow of which countless minds have been energized and spirits uplifted. The author of over 24 widely acclaimed books, Joseph is an amazingly lucid and skillful writer, speaker, editor, and educator of whom and of whose likeness our present age stands desperately, urgently in need. Included among his subjects of study are Shakespeare, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, and the man, the mystifying dandy, the self-destructive genius around whom today's conversation will loosely revolve, Oscar Wilde. Joseph, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a joy to be here.
I must confess at the outset that I've had difficulty selecting topics on which I'd like to get your opinions, a consequence, no doubt, of the vastness of your learning and the immeasurable lengths to which my own curiosity stretches. Now, while we agreed in advance of this conversation via email to discuss Oscar Wilde, a man, the very name of whom perhaps foredoomed him to a life of licentiousness and debauchery, and as we'll see, a premature end, you'll have to forgive me if I occasionally stray from the great Irish playwright and bring up some other thinkers about whom you've written so beautifully. Am I forgiven?
Oh, you don't need to be forgiven. I'll happily wander in whatever direction you decide to go.
Excellent. So we'll begin with Wilde. So Oscar Wilde is perhaps best known as a comedic playwright of unparalleled wit and the author of The Picture of Dorian Gray, without a proper reading of which a good high school education here in America, and I'm sure abroad, is woefully incomplete. Comedic as he was, however, Wilde's life was utterly tragic, in my opinion. Can you tell us how it came to be so tragic by providing a brief history of this extraordinary
Sure. I'll be pedantic before I become a biographer, if you like, of Wilde, and that's that we really, if we can use words like tragic, we have to define tragedy. And yes, in one sense, absolutely, Oscar Wilde's a tragic figure. You know, in the classic understanding of tragedy is the downfall of a man with great gifts because of a fatal flaw in his own personality. In that sense, you're absolutely right. Wilde is a tragic figure par excellence. But another understanding of tragedy in a broader, sort of more popular sense is just that which has an unhappy ending, as opposed to a comedy which has a happy ending. Well, you know, on the assumption that Oscar Wilde was right in his final decision, which was to be received into the Catholic Church, then receiving the last rites, having no chance to fall into sin afterwards because he rather conveniently died, then he certainly had a happy ending. So in some sense we can talk about Wilde's life as being a tragedy. In another sense we talk about being a divine comedy, and talking about the divine comedy, perhaps we could talk about it being also, in one sense, a purgatory, a purgatorio. So all of those elements are part of Oscar Wilde's life. Just to put a few bare bones on it, which will then perhaps give us what we need, the skeleton, so to speak, in which to flesh things out. Oscar Wilde was born in the 1850s, 1854, and lived until 1900. So a relatively short life. He died in his 40s. But a life which was a bit like a meteor, because once he rose to fame, for about 15 years, he was a household name. And best known to posterity probably for his one novel that you referenced already, which is one of the great Victorian novels, in fact one of the greatest novels in the English language period, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and also for his plays, perhaps especially The Importance of Being Earnest, but one or two others as well. And he also wrote poetry. He wrote a very long poem about his experience in prison, which we should obviously talk about, The Ballad of Reading Jail. But basically, he was married, had two young sons, but then started to dabble with the dark underbelly of, should we say, Victorian London, and was using male prostitutes and what have you. And then in a rather convoluted way, ended up getting himself sent to prison. And it's an oversimplification to say he was sent to prison because he was a homosexual. No, Wilde shot himself in the foot by accusing the Marquis of Queensberry of being libeling him and of committing slander. And the Marquis of Queensberry merely showed that what he accused Wilde of being, Wilde was. And that then meant that Wilde basically publicly exposed himself as breaking laws. Nobody was really that worried about policing, which forced the authorities to act. So it's a tragi-comedy is the actual court case. And then that led to 2 years imprisonment. And he lived for further 3 years afterwards, somewhat dissolutely. And then on his deathbed, his friend Robert Ross, at his request, asked for a priest who administered last rites, and then Wilde, hopefully at least, lived happily ever after. Yeah, speaking of happily ever after, by the way, speaking of happily ever after, I also, sin of omission, mea culpa, forgot to mention that he also wrote some wonderful children's stories and fairy stories. The Selfish Giant, for instance, and it would be a sin of omission not to mention those really charming tales. So if we're going to say that Wilde lived happily ever after, we should at least frame it in the sense that he wrote fairy stories for children.
All of which are accessible in a complete works volume that's available on Amazon. I know I have a copy myself, and it's delightful to go from, and sort of jarring to go from a work like The Picture of Dorian Gray to some of his fairy stories and children's stories. That was a compendious, very useful biographical sketch that you provided. Thank you for that. And I knowingly used the term tragic because he sort of was a character in the classical sense of high standing, somewhat aristocratic based on birth, and endowed with immense talent. Now, I want to continue just a little while longer on this idea of tragedy. Tragedy, as G.K. Chesterton said, in a collection of essays of which you are the editor and of which I have a copy behind me, is the highest expression of infinite value of human life. And Wilde's life, then, due to its extreme tragedy, in my opinion, is perhaps the highest expression of this expression. But Chesterton goes on in another essay to draw a distinction between Christian tragedy, exemplified by Shakespeare's Macbeth, and pagan tragedy, of which Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus is the crowning example. Which do you think is the higher form of tragedy, the Christian tragedy or the Greek tragedy?
Well, I'm going to live dangerously and controversially by daring to quibble with G.K. Chesterton, in the sense that we can't take Oedipus Rex, Oedipus Tyrannus, if you prefer, out of context with the two plays of which it forms a trilogy. So Antigone and Oedipus at Colonus. Now, Oedipus at Colonus, so Oedipus Rex begs all sorts of questions, largely, which is why it's so popular in our postmodern, secular fundamentalist, radical relativist culture. Because if you read Oedipus Rex out of context of Sophocles' other two plays that frame it, then what you see is lots of suffering that no one appears to be particularly to blame for, could have done very much about. And so the conclusion is, well, suffering is inevitable, but also ultimately meaningless, a bit like life, which is also ultimately meaningless, which is why it's such a popular play. But of course, the sequel that Sophocles wrote to that Oedipus of Colonus shows Oedipus as an old man with his daughter Antigone having laid down her life for her father by setting aside the comforts of marriage and comforts as comforts, and embracing the life of a beggar, acting as a guide, because of course the father's blind. And the moral of that is that the acceptance of suffering, not suffering, right? The acceptance of suffering is the meaning of life that bestows blessings upon the one who's suffering, but upon those who assist the one who's suffering. That's the moral of that, which is not very different from a Christian understanding of suffering. So basically, ultimately, the key, this is very much relates to Oscar Wilde's life. We're all of us, irrespective of what we believe and the lifestyle that we live, all of us are going to be crucified, in the sense that suffering is utterly unavoidable. So we are going to have to experience excruciating suffering in our lives sooner or later, at one point or another. And with the questions, what do we do with that? We can either respond like the bad thief to the left of Christ, who hates his suffering, blames God, blames everybody else except himself for his suffering, and dies a miserable death. Or you can be like the good thief to Christ's right, who knows that he's suffering because of his own sins, but accepts it. And even deeper than that, what about, this is a question that Homer asks in the Odyssey, when Zeus says the mortals blame us for their suffering, whereas it is by their own recklessness that they suffer beyond that which is given. So the real phrase there is, yes, most of the time human suffering is caused by human sin, right? Most of the time. But what about the wildfires in Southern California at the moment? Of course, some people say that's also partly to do with the politicians there. We'll leave all that on one side. But what about a natural disaster, right? Like a hurricane, right? Or an earthquake that no one can be responsible for, and yet it can cause vast misery. So that's the last part of Zeus's words, except that which is given. In other words, that some suffering's a gift, which is just given to us for us to respond to. And if we accept suffering when it comes to us, we are ennobled by it, we are enriched by it, and we become more serene, quite frankly, holier people, always needing the assistance of God. In other words, we can't carry our own crosses without help of our neighbor and the help of God. So anyway, I'm rambling here, but the point is that I don't see a chasm separating Sophocles from Shakespeare. On the contrary, I think both of them recognize the dignity of the human person. Now, from a Christian perspective, it's because we made the imago Dei, we made in the image of God. But either way, the dignity of the human person is what, and this is where Chesterton is correct. That's why tragedy is so powerful. If it wasn't for the dignity of the human person, we wouldn't care what happened to the protagonist in a tragedy. It's because we recognize their humanity and the dignity attached to that humanity that we suffer along with them, and we're horrified by events. So in that, I absolutely do agree with Chesterton.
Oh, brilliant! I need a few minutes to digest all of that. That was brilliantly put. I think, like you said, the Oedipal work, that singular work, is taken out of context, and when read, independent of its predecessor and its successor in the entirety of the trilogy, it can be a nihilistic work. So thank you for that elucidation. That was brilliantly put. Let's go a little deeper into Shakespeare's religion. Now, this is a topic about which you've been writing and for which you're rightly famous, and that's Shakespeare's Catholicism. Many listeners unacquainted with the theory of which you, I think among all literary scholars working today, are perhaps the most forceful expositor, say that Shakespeare was a Catholic. Now, I'm sure you're asked all the time, but one more from me. How did you arrive at this conclusion, and in what way has this theory been met by some of your colleagues or fellow scholars in the realm of literature?
That's a great question. So I began very much as a skeptic. When I arrived in the United States, I actually moved to the States 4 days before 9/11, so September the 7th, 2001. And I was teaching at Ave Maria College, as it then was, in Michigan, before it moved to Florida. And I had a colleague in the literature department there who was convinced that Shakespeare was a Catholic, and I sort of scoffed at the idea, saying we don't know enough about Shakespeare's life to have form any opinion on his religious beliefs. The only honest position to hold is one of agnosticism, in the sense we just don't know. But I liken it metaphorically to a jigsaw puzzle. So my thought was, well, let's say it's a 100-piece jigsaw puzzle. We only have 5 or 6 pieces. How can you possibly get a picture from the 5 or 6 pieces you have if the other 94 or 95 are missing. But what began to happen is I was just reading, first of all, just coming across things by chance, coming across other pieces of the puzzle, which seemed to point towards the fact that Shakespeare might have been a Catholic. So now maybe I've got 20 pieces of the puzzle, metaphorically. And at some point you think, hang on, there might be something to this. And then instead of coming across pieces of the puzzle by accident, just through reading, I started looking for the piece of puzzle. That's when the research began. And then I became completely convinced, maybe we've got 50 pieces of the puzzle now. And if you have 50 pieces of the puzzle spread out, you've got a pretty good idea of the picture, even though there were missing pieces still. So I believe, and I think I show in my book, The Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon, The Church of Rome, that you can show and prove beyond all reasonable doubt, like a court of law, that Shakespeare's a Catholic. If you look at the facts of his life, this is the only picture that holds up. All other counter pictures can be shown to be, if not false, then certainly very weak by comparison. So, and there's 2 ways you prove this, and that's why I've written more than one book. So the first book's the biographical and historical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism, which you can get from studying his life and his times. And then the other is the textual evidence by studying the plays and the poems. Mm-hmm. So my second book was called Through Shakespeare's Eyes, Seeing the Catholic Presence in the Plays. So this has been an ongoing research passion of mine. And just to answer your final part of the question there, how is this received by others? So certainly 40 or 50 years ago, it was only a small minority, would probably be seen to be a somewhat, what should we say, somewhat quirky minority that were claiming that Shakespeare was Catholic. But now it's become pretty mainstream. It certainly isn't now seen as being nonsense. On the contrary, it's seen as something you have to consider. And the way I like to see it, the anecdote I like to give, someone told me that they went to a talk by the director of the National Shakespeare Company in Washington, D.C., and a talk talks on some other Shakespeare subject, nothing to do with his religion. But in the Q&A session at the conclusion of his talk, someone just asked, well, what about Shakespeare's religion? What was Shakespeare's religion? And this person answered immediately, well, many people seem to think he was Catholic. So the fact that this secular, person on Shakespeare is one of the leading Shakespeare authorities, as the director of the National Shakespeare Company, when asked that question out of the blue, not expecting it, the first thing he answers is that many people think he's Catholic. So I think that basically this is now mainstream. It's not obviously completely and universally accepted, but it certainly is not out on the fringes anymore.
I'm sure that many secularists working in the academic departments in American universities are loath to admit to this or to arrive at this conclusion, despite the evidence laid out by scholars like yourself. So it's encouraging that many people are putting aside perhaps their ideologies and biases to accept what seems increasingly to be the case. Is there a play in which his alleged Catholicism is most readily detectable, in your opinion?
Well, there are many, numerous. I've now written on probably about a dozen of the plays, so over a third of them. His Catholicism emerges basically in all of them, but to varying degrees. Now, I'll give you some examples. For instance, there's a lot of intertextual nods in the direction of a Jesuit martyr, St. Robert Southwell of Southwell, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare's, probably knew Shakespeare, and the reason for that is that Shakespeare's patron, the Earl of Southampton, who was a recusant Catholic, so a defiant Catholic, had St. Robert Southwell as his personal chaplain and personal confessor. So Robert Southwell was a best-selling poet in London, the same time as Shakespeare's professional poet in London. They have the same acquaintance with the Earl of Southampton. To me, it's pretty inconceivable that they did not know each other. But beyond that, in his plays, so for instance, a large part of the famous graveyard scene in Hamlet, the bit that Las por Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, that scene which everyone knows so well, is an engagement with a poem that St. Robert Southwell wrote upon the image of death. And if you read St. Robert Southwell's poem upon the image of death side by side with this scene, and Hamlet's words in this scene in particular, you will see that Shakespeare is deliberately nodding in the direction of Sir Robert Southwell, who had been martyred, executed for his priesthood only 5 years before Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. I could give many other examples, but that's one at least.
Oh, I think that will suffice, and it's an excellent example to provide. I'll just comment briefly. Personal confessor. It would be nice these days we brought them back and perhaps substituted them for personal trainers that seem to be so ubiquitous. A personal confessor instead. So,
well, spiritual health is at least as important as physical health.
Oh, undoubtedly, perhaps even more. One must care for the soul, I think, just as much, if not more, than for the body. Let me jump back to Wilde, and it's a broader theme, but he assists me in bringing it up. From The Decay of Lying, a philosophical dialogue between characters Cyril and Vivian, which just so happen to be the names of Wilde's sons, from whom he was estranged. Cyril asks Vivian in this dialogue to explain the doctrine or the doctrines of the new aesthetics, as he calls them, of which his interlocutor, Vivian, is a proud devotee. In response to which Vivian, the mouthpiece of Wilde, says the following. He says, quote, "Art never expresses anything but itself." In other words, art is, and you emphasize this later in the work, Unmasking Oscar Wilde, art is and always ought to be for its own sake. So I'll ask you the question, although I know the answer to it, Joe. Is this satisfactory? And if not, for what or for whose sake other than its own is art?
Yeah, first thing I'd like to say, The Decay of Lying is probably the most poisonous thing Oscar Wilde ever wrote. It's also not a great work of art because, you know, that Cyril is just a foil. There's not a serious discussion. Basically, Cyril just asks a simple question like sticking out your jaw in a boxing match, just so the other person can give you a right hook. So it's not a great work of art. It's not a great work of dialectic or rhetoric. It's not Wilde at his best. In fact, it's Wilde at his most poisonous. Also, Wilde is at his most pretentious. And this is the other thing you have to realize about Oscar Wilde is when is he actually himself wearing a mask, right? And when is he not wearing a mask? And there was certainly a time prior to his downfall when he was wearing so many masks that I think he also became somewhat confused as to who the real Oscar Wilde was. People of my generation will think perhaps of David Bowie, and the Ziggy Stardust, and basically you wear a persona for so long that you find it difficult to separate yourself from it. And I think that's where Wilde was. At the time he was writing this, and it led to his downfall. But in The Picture Dorian Gray, which is, I think, his greatest work, he contradicts himself because on one hand, he basically repeats that. There's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. So that sort of art is just art. But then he states further in the preface that basically the whole purpose of art is to express truth, express morality. I can't remember the exact phraseology offhand. You have to forgive me. So the point is that even the preface contradicts itself. And Wilde, in defending The Picture of Dorian Gray, ironically, is accused of being a work of decadence. He says, on the contrary, its morality is too obvious. And I think, to be fair to Wilde, this is what he's getting at, is that art should not be a vehicle for propaganda. Right, that's so that insofar as we could take these words of Wilde seriously, that while art is something which should be beautiful, good, true, and beautiful in itself, and that the truths should emerge from that goodness, truth, and beauty. They should not be lessons which are preached and taught like an obvious moral. So, in that sense, he's correct. But if he's trying to suggest, and I think at his worst he is, that there's no such thing as a moral or immoral art, then he's wrong, and he knows it, and he says so himself elsewhere.
Yeah. Part of the mystery of Wilde is, or are the constant contradictions that you point out in your biography of him, and sometimes they make you chuckle, but sometimes they make you cringe, they make you recoil and wonder, what truly does this man believe? Of course, the epigrammatic style is just it's so lapidary, it's so immortal, and you love to quote it, but you also have to put it into its context, as you just did, and wonder, truly what does this man feel? What does he think? And who is he ultimately? So on that point of art for art's sake, you write that it's only an agnostic substitute for art for God's sake, and it's a falling away from a higher truth to a lesser one. Have we in this generation fallen from the higher truth, indeed the highest truth, and landed on a lesser one? And if so, is there any, a possibility of a reascent, a summiting toward that higher good, that higher truth, that I think both you and I would like to see people reattain?
Yeah, well, the best way of answering that within the context of our conversation would be to see Wilde's own life as an answer to your question. That when we fall from higher truths to lower truths, when we fall away from goodness, truth, and beauty towards basically evil, falsehood, and ugliness in its various manifestations, the best curative for us is to have our masks stripped away from us through the experience of excruciating suffering. In other words, that the way that we are brought to truth is usually through suffering, because then all of our artificial accretions, our masks, our artificiality, our artifices are stripped away, and we are seen there, ecce homo, behold the man, in our nakedness. And it's only when we see ourselves in our nakedness, as indeed Dorian Gray does, when he, or as we do in the moral that's shown us, when we behold the picture of Dorian Gray. That's a mirror of Dorian Gray's soul. That we have to have our mask stripped away so we can look beautiful on the outside, cosmetically, as does Dorian Gray. But what are we inside? And if we are as corrupt as the picture of Dorian Gray suggests that we are, we need to have that ripped away through suffering. And so that's why suffering is a gift. And that's why it's a hard one to accept, but it's absolutely necessary to accept it because it's unavoidable. What do we do with it when we get it? So that Oscar Wilde's, what stripped Oscar Wilde's mask away from him was going to prison. If you want to know what Oscar Wilde, at his stripped to the naked Oscar Wilde, read De Profundis, the letter that he wrote to Lord Alfred Douglas from prison. There's no pretense. He's not playing to an audience. He's not posing. This is Oscar Wilde. Not necessarily completely good. I mean, certainly a Catholic, certainly someone who's knows he's a miserable sinner, struggling towards goodness, hoping and asking for God's help, but also very angry with Lord Alfred Douglas. So a man who's conflicted. So in other words, you strip away all of the cosmetics and you see the naked truth, and even that is ugly, but beyond the ugliness, you see a soul longing for union with God. And that ultimately is the meaning of life.
I think that's one of the saddest and happiest parts about Wilde's life. You sense that yearning, and you see him time and again fall short and relapse and recommence bad habits, especially with Douglas, that lead him down the path of wretchedness, and you just want to reach out and shake him and help him and guide him. What advice would you have given him had you been in the position of his interlocutors or his literary friends or critics? You certainly would have fit the mold at that time. What might you have advised Wilde to do, or perhaps any high thinker who finds himself in a self-destructive spiral?
Well, to answer the first part of your question first, and it probably is equally applicable to the second part. In other words, it's universal. The best advice that I could give Oscar Wilde was given him. I quote it at length in my biography of Oscar Wilde, when Oscar Wilde during his lifetime, he's obviously was unfaithful to his wife and his children, but he was also unfaithful to his lifelong love affair, which predated his meeting his wife, and that was his love affair with the Catholic Church. So he wanted to be received in the church as an undergraduate, both in Dublin and in Oxford, and it was only because his father threatened to disinherit him that he failed to take the step. So again, choosing worldly comfort over conscience, that's a mistake he makes early on and continues to repeat. So Wilde's relationship with the Catholic Church is a lifelong love affair, of which he is a very unfaithful party to that affair, an unfaithful lover, and his reception of the church is the final consummation in marriage, if you like, of that love affair. So he's a weak person. So during the course of these various occasions when he almost converts, he visits Father Sebastian Bowden at the London Oratory. And there's a wonderful letter that Father Bowden sends Wilde after their first meeting, where he just gives the perfect advice, and wants, looking for the next meeting to continue the conversation. And Wilde doesn't have the courage to turn up for the next conversation. So he's told the truth. But really, I could not give Wilde better advice than the advice Father Sebastian Bowden gave him, and basically just telling him that you're living a lie. You can't continue to live a lie. That you basically have to embrace hard truths, embrace suffering. He puts it much better than I do. But the advice that Father Bowden gave to Wilde would be applicable to anybody who's sliding into a decadent lifestyle.
Right, embrace suffering. I want to conclude with the few minutes that we have remaining with a statement from your website, to which I'll include a link in the show notes below, and to which I invite everyone to pay a visit once this episode is through. Movingly, you state that, quote, "It is my greatest hope that my work of writing and speaking will spark in you a greater desire to slow down and to develop a sense of wonder." I think that's so beautifully put. Tell me, Joseph, how does one develop a sense of wonder?
Well, first of all, by slowing down. But ultimately, let's. I'm going to get deep here and try to do it in about 2 minutes. We know about our 5 physical senses. So that's, we all know that, but there are 5 metaphysical senses which are sequential, that one follows on from the other, right? So the first and necessary of all the metaphysical senses is humility. If we have humility, a fruit of humility will be a sense of gratitude. If we have a sense of gratitude, our eyes will be opened in wonder. That's the third. So humility, gratitude, wonder. If our eyes are open in wonder, we'll be moved to contemplation. That's the fourth. And it's only when we move to contemplation that we experience dilation, what St. Thomas Aquinas calls dilatatio, dilation, the opening of the mind and soul into the fullness of reality. So you don't engage reality in its fullness unless you have humility, gratitude, wonder, contemplation. And then that leads to the dilation. Now, all of that requires taking your time. And one other little story, I sent out a monthly newsletter, and the January one was, should we hike or ramble through life? And I use a real life story here. C.S. Lewis and his brother Warnie were out hiking in the countryside of England, the west of England, with 2 of their friends, J.R.R. Tolkien and George Sayer. And George Sayer is the source of this story. So the Lewis brothers, so C.S. Lewis and Warnie, they like to hike, exercise. You go out, you walk vigorously and rigorously, and you get to where you're going, which is usually a pub. Right. So this is the purpose of the exercise. Well, they invite Tolkien along, and George Sayer. Well, they want to go off ahead. Tolkien is sort of stopping and looking at a wild flower or a butterfly or a tree and not making much progress. And the Lewis brothers are getting more and more frustrated because they're not getting from A to B in the way that they imagine. So in the end, they say to George Sayer, look, we're going to hike on ahead. You and Tolkien get to the pub, meet us there whenever you like. So the question I ask, given this story, which is a true story, is which is the best way to take the path of life? If our life is a pilgrimage, which it is, the purpose of which is to get to heaven, then which path should we take? Well, the first thing is they are both pairs of people are taking the same path. So it's not as if one's taking the wrong path and the other's taking the right path. But if how should we take the path, right? Should we try to expedite? Or should we have a sense of gratitude that leads to a sense of wonder, and realizing that we getting there, first shall be last and the last shall be first, right? And we could die tomorrow, or we could live to be 95. So we don't even know how long the journey is. The important thing is to be engaging with it while we're on it. And I would suggest that Tolkien's way of doing it, just stopping, the most valuable time in any day is when we can find silence. It's in silence we have good prayer. It's in silence when we can read good poetry or good literature. It's in silence. I'm very blessed here looking out the window, a bank of trees across a half acre and a creek, just to be communing with that beauty which is there. God gives us a work of art every morning called a sunrise, right? And every sunrise is a unique work of art. No two sunrises are the same. And yet most of the time we don't even bother to look, right? And I would suggest that if we could find 15 minutes every day to experience every sunrise, we'd be happier people and closer to God and further along the path by taking our time.
I can personally attest to the efficacy of this technique of slowing down and of deeply appreciating what is seemingly a quotidian basic fact of life, of nature, such as a sunrise, or as I prefer, a sunset, a beautiful sunset over the Gulf of Mexico. I will add maybe just one more character to this group of four, whose work I think would be especially relevant, and that is Henry David Thoreau, the American transcendentalist. He, for everyone listening who is interested in this concept of slowing down, he speaks very movingly about the art of walking and engaging with nature in a very spiritual way, if not a Catholic way, but still a spiritual way. So, Joseph, I mentioned the website where all of your excellent articles, of which there's a profusion, can be found. Of course, there is the Inner Sanctum on that website, of which you can become a member, and I strongly encourage everybody listening to do so. I, again, can attest to the breadth of topics about which you write at an extraordinarily rapid pace. You'll go onto this website and see posts after post after post, dated only a few days apart. And all of the articles are enriching and very thoughtful, from a very thoughtful man. So I will include a link to that website in the show notes below, and I encourage everybody to visit them. Joseph, are there any other places where people can find you or contact you?
Well, actually, that one of the purposes of the website is to be the one-stop place. I don't encourage people to go to Amazon for everything, but I do encourage them to go to jpearce.co for everything, because that's where they'll find everything. So, anything I get published, any journals online I'll get published in, I then post them to the website. So, you can either be looking all over the place at various journals for what I'm writing, or just go to the one place where they're all going to be gathered together like sheep anyway. So that's the one-stop place. But there's also book tags, so you can get direct links to the publishers for all my books. So, and the Inner Sanctum you mentioned, I post, record and post 4 new exclusive podcasts every week in the Inner Sanctum. So yeah, check it out, jpearce.co.
Yeah, it's certainly worth your while. So with that, Joseph, again, a million thanks for joining me. We went a little bit over time, but I could go on for hours with you. I still have a number of questions that I'd love to pose to you. Perhaps in the future we will get together again, perhaps over a steak down here in Florida the next time that you visit. Is there any final message with which you'd like to leave our listeners today?
Well, the one thing when you were saying about went over time, that I'm always reminded of a quip of G.K. Chesterton. He said the only way of being sure of catching a train is to miss the one before it. So the only way we could be sure of meeting our deadline of not going over 30 minutes is to go to 40 minutes instead, which is absolutely fine.
Oh, just delightful. All right. Well, with that, I thank you. And to all of my listeners out there, fare thee well. This is your humble host, Daniel Finneran, on Finneran's Wake. Until next time, farewell.